There is a country right now with more active Mormon church members than almost anywhere else on earth. And it is not the United States. It is not anywhere in Europe. And if I told you before this video that you would finish it completely shocked by what happened in this country, I would be right. Because what unfolded in Brazil over the last century inside the Mormon Church is one of the strangest, most unexpected, and most strategically significant stories in the entire history of organized religion. And almost nobody in Europe is talking about it. Stay with me, because this one is going to hit different. And if you are new here, welcome to History Unmasked. We do not do surface level here. We go deep into the stories that the history books gloss over. Hit that subscribe button right now because you do not want to miss what is coming in this video or what we are releasing next. Let us start with a number that will stop you cold. Brazil currently has approximately 1.4 million members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. 1.4 million. To put that in context, for a European audience, the entire population of Estonia is around 1.3 million people. Brazil has more Mormons than Estonia has people. The country has over 200 stakes, which in LDS church structure is essentially a regional governing unit, indicating a deeply rooted mature congregation, not just a missionary outpost. There are multiple operating temples across Brazilian soil, with more announced, and Brazil has produced general authorities, meaning senior church leaders who serve at the highest levels of the global institution. This is not a fringe presence, this is a full-scale religious establishment. But here is the thing. None of this was supposed to happen. And when you learn how it did happen, you will understand that this story is not really about religion at all. It is about timing, strategy, identity, and one of the most uncomfortable theological crises in modern church history. To understand why Brazil became what it is today inside the LDS Church, you have to go back to the very beginning of Mormon missionary work in South America. The Church first sent missionaries to Brazil in 1928. 1928. That is nearly 100 years ago. But here is where it immediately gets complicated, and I want you to think about this carefully. Brazil in the 1920s was a nation shaped almost entirely by the legacy of the Atlantic slave trade. More enslaved Africans were brought to Brazil than to any other country in the Americas. Estimates suggest around 4.9 million people. The result was that by the early 20th century, Brazil had the largest African-descended population outside of Africa itself. And the LDS Church at that time had a standing policy, the Priesthood Ban, that restricted black members of African descent from holding the priesthood or entering temples. So the Church sent missionaries to a country where the majority of the population had some degree of African ancestry, and then the Church tried to enforce a racial restriction that was essentially impossible to apply in a country where racial identity existed on a spectrum so broad and so complex that even the government struggled to categorize it. This was not a minor logistical problem. This was a theological and institutional crisis waiting to explode, and eventually it did. Here's the question I want you to sit with and answer in the comments below. If a church enters a country whose population fundamentally challenges the logic of one of its core policies, what do you think that church should do? Adapt, withdraw, ignore the contradiction, and push forward? Drop your honest answer, because what the LDS Church actually did in Brazil is one of the options on that list, and it will surprise you. For decades, the Church grew slowly but consistently in Brazil by focusing its missionary efforts on communities it could more clearly classify as not having African ancestry. European immigrant communities, particularly German and Italian settlers who had come to southern Brazil in large numbers during the 19th and early 20th centuries, became the early foundation of Brazilian LDS membership. Cities like Porto Alegre in Rio Grande do Sul, a region with heavy European immigrant heritage, became early hubs of the Brazilian LDS community. The Church was building on the one demographic in Brazil that did not force a confrontation with the priesthood ban, and it worked. For a while, but Brazil was not going to stay neatly divided. The country was urbanizing. Families were mixing, communities were blending, and the Church was growing into territory where the racial question became impossible to avoid. By the 1970s, the LDS Church in Brazil faced a problem that had no clean solution under its existing theology. And now, here is the twist. The moment that changed everything. Not just for Brazil, for the entire world. In 1974, the LDS Church announced it would build its first temple in South America, in Brazil, in Sao Paulo. This was a monumental declaration. A temple is not a regular chapel. In LDS theology, the temple is where the most sacred and eternally significant ordinances take place. Sealings, endowments, ceremonies that the church teaches are necessary for the highest level of exaltation. And the church had just committed to building one in the most racially complex nation on earth. Think about what that meant. Thousands of Brazilian members who had been faithful for years, who had built congregations, who had sacrificed for the church. Many of them had African ancestry, detectable or not. And under the existing policy, they could not enter the temple that was being built in their own country for their own community. The contradiction had become a physical structure under construction. You could watch it being built. You could not deny it. Church leaders reportedly met with Brazilian members and encountered situations where they genuinely could not determine who among the membership would qualify under the priesthood ban. The policy was not just unjust in Brazil, it was operationally impossible. And then in June 1978, 2 years before the Sao Paulo Temple was dedicated, Church President Spencer W. Kimball announced official declaration to the priesthood ban was lifted. Every worthy male member, regardless of race or ancestry, could now hold the priesthood. Every member could now enter the temple. The Sao Paulo Temple was dedicated in 1978, right on schedule. And the explosion that followed in Brazil was unlike anything the church had seen anywhere outside the United States. Now I want your honest reaction to this in the comments. Do you believe the construction of the Sao Paulo Temple and the pressure of the Brazilian demographic situation influenced the timing of that 1978 revelation? Or do you take the church at its word, that it was purely a matter of divine timing? This is not a trick question. There are serious religious scholars on both sides of this debate, and I genuinely want to know where you stand. Because what happened next in Brazil cannot be separated from that answer. After 1978, Brazilian missionary work effectively had no ceiling. The church could now approach any Brazilian regardless of background. And Brazil responded in a way that stunned even the most optimistic church planners. The country had a hunger for community, for structure, for a moral framework that could hold families together in the middle of rapid urbanization and economic uncertainty. Sound familiar? This is the same dynamic we have seen in Africa, in the Philippines, in parts of Eastern Europe. The LDS Church did not just offer theology, it offered a complete social architecture. Weekly meetings, youth programs, welfare assistance, tight networks of mutual aid. In a country where the gap between rich and poor was staggering, and where government institutions were frequently corrupt or simply absent, the church provided something the state could. Not consistency, belonging, and a promise that your family mattered eternally. Brazil also offered something the church found enormously valuable in return. Scale, a huge Spanish-speaking population that was actually Portuguese-speaking, and therefore a gateway into a linguistically distinct but culturally connected world. Brazilians became missionaries themselves in extraordinary numbers. Brazilian missionaries began serving across Latin America, in Portugal, in parts of Africa, in Lusophone communities around the world. The church had not just gained members in Brazil, it had gained a missionary force of enormous reach and cultural fluency. But here's what the numbers do not fully capture, and what I think is the most important and underreported part of this entire story. Brazil changed the LDS Church as much as the LDS Church changed Brazil. The theology that permitted racial exclusion for 148 years was functionally ended by the impossibility of enforcing it in Brazilian soil. Brazilian culture, warmth, expressiveness, and community orientation have influenced how the church feels and functions in South America in ways that are visibly different from the Utah-founded model. Brazilian general authorities have brought perspectives into the highest levels of church leadership that simply did not exist before. And Brazilian membership data is now used by church demographers to argue that the future of the LDS Church is not in North America or Europe, it is in the global South. So here is what I want you to take from this. The story of Mormonism in Brazil is not simply a missionary success story. It is the story of how a rigid institution collided with an impossibly complex society and was forced to change. It is the story of how geography, history, race, and strategy intersected to create one of the most unlikely religious landscapes on the planet. And it is a story that raises questions about faith, power, and institutional honesty that none of us can fully resolve, but all of us should be thinking about. Last question, and please put this one in the comments because I want to have this conversation with you directly. From where you sit in Europe, does the growth of an American-founded church in Brazil look like genuine spiritual movement, strategic institutional expansion, or something in between? There is no wrong answer. What matters is that you are thinking critically about how religion moves through the world and why. Drop it below. I read everything. If this video gave you something to think about, then History Unmasked is the channel you have been looking for. Every week we go behind the official version of events and find the story underneath the story. The history that got edited out, the patterns that nobody connected, the questions that powerful institutions would rather you not ask. Subscribe right now. It is completely free, and it means you will not miss what we are putting out next. Share this video with someone who loves real history. Not the textbook version, the real version. I will see you in the next one.